Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Empowered Performance Podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Josh Bray. As far as young coaches who are doing the work and they're locked into this profession and showing amazing promise, but already at a high level, Josh is definitely one of the coaches that I think of. Josh, if you don't mind introducing yourself, can you just tell us about your athletic background and what you do right now?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say I come from a bit of a unique background overall as it goes for athletics because I grew up on a private boarding school campus where my father is still the athletic director, but for the last 32 years. So grew up on campus, growing up with adolescents in the house that my father was also a house parent for. So he's working with a small group of kids in a dorm as well as managing all the athletics. So growing up with a lot of adolescents, I'm on the field, I'm with all the athletes. It's just kind of ingrained in me, right? And then I'm going through life and naturally you go to the school as well. And I'm playing sports there. And one of the unique elements of the school is that you have to play 3 sports throughout the
Wow.
year. So that's nice. So you get a bit of that multi sport development as is. And then just further and further on, I started committing to the sporting world a little bit more and seeing that I had some form of athletic talent in it, at least a lot of drive for preparation until my later years in high school where I started to kind of go all in on rugby and that became my central sport. Rugby took me really all over the world. I played at the local university, had a pretty good career overall. Then that brought me to New Zealand, where I played there for the year, worked at a school while coaching rugby as well. And then I got to that point during my time across on the other side of the world where I was like, okay, I've found myself, if you will, and I've recognized that the biology degree I left university with wasn't really what I wanted to do. The one thing that was always there for me, the one thing that I planned my trips around, planned my life around was fitness. So one thing people ask me about what I helped my friends in university with. I went ahead and got my CSCS, my personal training, anything that came with a couple letters behind my name, I started to chase, as we all do. And then I just took the chance to reach out to my alma mater for the rugby team. I said, hey, this is a service I believe I can provide well. Would you be interested? And I did the same thing at the high school, reached out to a couple coaches. I said, I think this is an opportunity for us to take it up a notch. And this is what I can provide. And very fortunately, both of them accepted the opportunity. So I already got my hands in 2 buckets here at home. I had the ability to stay at home and just start working the practice and learning, getting all my failures out early. Working with a university provided so many other challenges that the high school didn't, and vice versa. And then, so on and so forth. I just kept going and going and going, always working alone, never really having any mentor or any real assistance. So it was constant, baptism by fire, if you will. So it forced me to learn a lot. And then here I am, just short of 10 years into coaching. And, you say I'm up and coming, and I appreciate that. I wouldn't consider myself that much, but I do have some opinions on things, and I do love to teach. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of similarities in that sense. I actually started going in the soccer coaching direction, youth sports, and I enjoyed coaching high school. I felt at that age range, the kids were mature enough that they would take coaching a little bit better, and that parents, when it comes to high school, they're not paying, at least in the States, that's how it is. So they weren't involved. They weren't so chatty and high with expectations. But when I was coaching club, the higher ups at the club would always sell this whole dream of your kid can be the next pro or D1 player, even if the kid had zero passion for it. And so I was working with U8 U10s. And these kids, the first thing I do is get them to fall in love with sport, period. Regardless of the sport, play multiple sports, develop, like you said, the benefit of having 3 sports year round makes you have an incredibly wide base, which is potential for a high pyramid. So I got kind of fed up with coaching soccer, but I loved coaching. During that period, I got my CSCS as well. I had an internship in Cincinnati when my wife was getting her master's. And then COVID, moved back home with my parents to save some money. And I was like, there's no place hiring right now, but I have power box and I have a trunk. So I just put the power box in the trunk. I started my mobile training business. But there's something to be said in your story, lessons to be learned already. One, there's a lot of people that wait for perfect opportunity or wait until they feel that they're ready to put themselves out there. And you had a passion and you reached out to people immediately and said, I think I can do this. And so one, there's courage, just getting your foot in the door. A lot of people never even take that shot. But then I think I may have talked about this with Steve. Anybody listening to Steve White, look him up. He's incredible. But I talked about the difference between 15 minutes of fame and overnight success. And I think the difference is staying power. And 15 minutes of fame, there's really no substance. So, you get your little explosion and you disappear into nothingness. But if you actually have some staying power, or at least develop it, right, then you can last and be quote unquote an overnight success. And I'm sure you had the hard work and the passion to be successful. And you're talking about the failures too. There's a lot of people that won't start until it's perfect, and there's arrogance to that because there's people who've done it for 20 years and it's still not perfect.
Sure.
Um, so already, I mean, you haven't said a lot other than just your kind of your background and all the stuff. And I think there's a lot that listeners can take away from this as to how to find success in their fields. So I definitely want to commend you for that.
Thank
I was going to ask you. You were speaking about the differences between the college sector or just college versus high school. What would those differences be?
Yeah, well, I say that in some capacity, and when we're talking about if we're talking about just physical capacities, obviously
Sure.
that's the elephant in the room, and that's the big one. But in other ways, there's actually not a lot where we go into these collegiate sectors, and I'm sure we can get into this, but like us folks that aren't currently in the collegiate sector, and that when I think of like NCAA
Mhm.
collegiate. Big, powerful
Mhm.
programs, we think that's the glory, right? That's where everything is. But when we're at least in the Canadian collegiate sector, it's a lot smaller, under resourced.
Mhm.
You get a lot of younger athletes coming into programs. Depending on their high school structure. For us in Quebec, this particular university being an English university, we get a lot of Ontario kids who come in at
Mhm.
like 17 or 18. So where
Mhm.
I'm going with this is that a lot of them, from a physical development standpoint, aren't very far off from the high school.
Mhm.
Mentally, not too far off. You've given them a bunch of autonomy. All of a sudden, there's, sex, drugs, and alcohol involved. And, it's a complete gong show. So there's equal parts, a lot of management. But like you said about the high school students, they have to be there. So
Mhm.
we're building habits in a different way. We're building habits based off the fact that, okay, you have to be here. We're gonna silo you and ensure that you're guided in the right direction versus university students. While yes, they are paying to be there, a lot of them on their own dime, they're young adults and they're making their own decisions, right? So there's a little bit more management of, I don't know, bigger characters, let's say, rather than in high school, which has its own toils. So I guess the biggest differences there are going to be typically resources from my experience. Working with a different kind of timetable, it's less rigid and set in stone. You are working with a generally on the upper end year athletes. You are working with a bit higher pedigree, someone with a little bit more of a training base, a little bit better movement literacy. And
Mhm.
typically with autonomy also comes a little bit more discipline, commitment, and drive. So you do get a little bit more of that. Whereas the older years in high school, they're just getting a grasp of how things work, but you still have to, supervise them with everything. From a physical capacity, it differs. I am in a unique situation in the sense that I work with, if you would like to call it elite or otherwise, I would consider it elite considering the amount of game volume, the amount
Mhm.
of training, and the capacities these kids do express. My high school hockey guys were putting up a lot of numbers and a lot of speeds and force expression akin to upperclassmen in the university sector. So that's what makes it a bit unique. But typically, of course, we're going to see a lower maximum capacity, lower movement literacy in the younger guys compared to our university varsity players, if you will.
Definitely go down the rabbit hole of character building, or so I don't like the idea of just like punishing athletes and it'll make them tougher and better and all that stuff. But there's definitely a sweet spot between the carrot and the stick. And I mean, I even found that today when I was coaching the. I told you before the podcast, I'm helping a 13-year-old rehab from a post ACL, and he doesn't necessarily love the gym. He doesn't love the weight room. A lot of this like coaching I find is mental. He's in the weight room. It's all like, I don't know if I can do this, that, the other. And it's like, as long as you have this wishy-washy attitude, you're not gonna put in your best intent, you're not gonna make a lot of gains, so we gotta lock in. I was like, "Tell yourself you can do something and then prove yourself right, and then just keep doing that forever." But then when we're on the field, then he's just like a yappy kid, who just wants to talk shit the whole time.
Yeah.
And so at the end, we played like 1v1 like I told you, and, I'm taking it easy, I don't wanna, like, tackle him or anything like that, and he gets a goal, and he starts just chirping, and then
Uh,
it was first to 5, and I scored 5 on him in a row, and I was, like, nutmegging him and all that stuff, and I was like, "Buddy, what did you expect?" But that's something that I definitely struggled with as a high school coach, from my soccer coaching days, was how much, since we're also younger coaches, how much is it, being a friend versus being the disciplinarian, finding that balance? Does it matter kid to kid? What I found is that the nerdy kids, you build them up, and the kind of brash, confident kids, you kind of put them down a little bit. They need a little kick in the teeth. But I'm curious how you go about setting a culture. What were your techniques?
Yeah, and I love this topic because this is something that we go into pretty heavily with the interns that I have
Mhm.
because you go through the pedagogical approach of S&C where you learn the X's and O's and 3 by
Mhm.
10 and yada yada yada. But then you get into the real world, and then you're faced with all this chaos, and you're people managing, right? At
Mhm,
least 50% of what your bandwidth is allocated to is managing people. In high
mhm,
school, probably 75%. So I always hang right at the top of the pyramid, culture or
mhm,
habit, as the number one thing that we're going to focus on. It's not going to obviously going to forego good training, but fundamentally, as I revisit what I said before, it's about building good habits. So if we
mhm,
can build good, strong standard that starts with myself, starts with the intern, starts with our program, it's going to filter through, and it's going to hack away any of those, outliers who are a bit of a bit of an asshole, or someone that doesn't is just too underconfident with themselves. So how do I go about that? I said this phrase yesterday to the rugby team. I still coach rugby, and I said, guys, I firmly believe that you don't get enough hard love in life, and
mhm,
that's okay because you're going to get it from me. And it's never anything personal, and I'm never saying anything to attack anyone. It's all constructive, but a little bit of intensity and being forward goes a long way. We talk about these kids that are, they're overloaded with social media, they're overloaded with opinions, and they're
mhm,
highly, highly entitled for some odd reason. And of course, that comes from family history and environment and their social circles. But the reality is, when we have the microphone and we're in charge, we get to set the standard of what the expectations are. And for me, the best way to do that is in equal parts being a hard ass on them, like you said, but also creating an environment and a space through, like, yeah, we can talk about music, we can talk about the intricacies of the lighting and the room that we create, but I think the connection that we have ultimately ourselves with those athletes is number one.
mhm,
How are you today? If we see someone that's off, maybe we touch on that. How are you feeling? Why are you off today? I noticed that you're a little bit down. Usually you train hard, or you recognize certain people that usually hide in the corner are now working hard today. Okay, what's that a result of, right? So it's pulling back these layers, understanding the player, understanding the person
mhm,
first and foremost. And then from there, you can start to throw your jabs where necessary, or you can pull back where necessary. Yeah, techniques for me, like, it's weird because I would say myself, I'm not a type A person. I don't feel like a type A person. I would say I'm more introverted. That's
mhm,
how I feel about myself. But then I coach 10 hours a day, right? So I'm just talking all this time to all these kids, socializing. Maybe that's why I'm all burnt out all the time. But for me, it starts right off the bat.
mhm,
We're getting touch points, we're getting high fives, we're getting people in, we're making a joke. If I make a mistake, I catch that, make them laugh, right? If there's some older guys in the group, we can make fun of them because I know they can take it, and that kind of breaks down some walls with some of the younger or newer players. And they say, okay, this guy's pretty chill, but at the same time, cut shit out right away. First meeting, even if this happened the other day and it's March and we've been together since September,
mhm,
bring everyone in. All right, everyone, sit on the floor. They all sit down. They're nice and close. They can look up at me and pay attention. A couple guys talking, cut it out right away. Single them out in front of others to
mhm,
recognize that that's the standard in the group.
mhm,
At the same time, make them deliberately know that, I'm not going to take any of that, even if it's March, right? So little things like that. I think what's important is always giving yourself enough time and space. Um, and what I mean by that, interns come in, they're overwhelmed by the chaos,
mhm,
and they want to create some authority, right? But there's 25 guys and they all know what's going on, but the interns don't, and they're trying to quiet them down. And what I teach them is to be able to give themselves some space and time to think, which gives them confidence and calmness. Make them run, make them take a lap of whatever, hit the stairs. Okay, boys, wall sit. We're going to do some toe lifts. We can justify it as preparatory work, but it's giving us a bit of time to cool down, get the energy of the room down, and then be able to commute effectively. Other than that, I mean, we could go into all sorts of things. I think it inherently, I ask my wife this all the time. These kids are walking around campus and they're always saying, hi, Josh, hi, Josh. And I don't know why. Like, I don't know why they gravitate towards me. Maybe it's just a bit of charisma here or there, or that I actually call them out on shit. But I just, first and foremost, it's can't be understated. And I'll stop rambling. That we connect with the person first, and that plays into what they're able to do, what they like to do, and how we're going to go about doing it.
I found that I was very fortunate in my first ever coaching role, high school coaching, because I was, like, the 3rd team coach. There's 3 teams, so normally it's, like, varsity JV, this one had a 3rd team. That was my first ever job, and the director of the program, who was also the varsity coach, was about as good a person as I've ever met in the coaching world. And he always talked about what you're saying, which is people first, athlete second. But it's just a buzzword you hear all the time, and you actually have to see someone live it, where it actually makes a difference. And if someone was late, he had rules. You'd sit out. Someone was disrespectful. If someone had bad grades, whatever. And he always said, like, he's like, I want you to be a good dude first, and
Mhm.
then we could talk about playing time. And just by setting that culture, the team played so well because they played for each other. And it was also like the leaders in the team would basically be the enforcers of culture anyways, that he didn't even have to do that much. And it was almost like he just had a few pivotal moments that he got right. And it seemed to make everything else fall in line. And I definitely learned that. And talking about personalities, one of the things that I learned was from my college playing days was if you have the rebellious kids go against the coach and all that stuff, and then the cool kids, that can kind of sow division. So what I did when I became a coach was I was like, all right, I'm not going to let these like the cool kids be my enemies. So I ended
Right.
up making them my captains, whether they deserved it or not. But then I put extra expectations and pressure on them. And then I would also hold them accountable in front of others. And then I would also encourage effort and training and all these different things for playing time over purely results. So I really did try to make it as much meritocracy as possible, and also try to align the people who would be troublemakers on my side, keep a handle on them and all that stuff. But it's definitely it was such a unique thing because your word choice mattered. Sometimes players would play too tense and you gotta tell them. I mean, there's one game where I said, "Score the ugliest goal you could possibly imagine," because they try to score a perfect goal. They try to dribble 5 players, score top bins. It counts the same as if it bounces off your face and goes in off the cross.
Yeah.
I tell them, "Score as many ugly goals as you can," and these kids just have, like, the shackles off, and for whatever reason, they started scoring beautiful goals and just tons of goals and any goal, and they were just so hungry for goals. There's a power to coaching in that sense. There's a responsibility to coaching, and then also finding that balance. And I'm sure I didn't get it right every time because I know there's some times where maybe I was a little too harsh.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, there's one time where the lessons learned the hard way. My first ever season coaching, we tried to incentivize players with bets. If you
Mm.
score 3 goals, one of my assistant coach said he'd buy a kid Chick-fil-A if he scored a hat trick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looking back, I wouldn't do that.
No.
But, like, I made a bet with somebody who seemed unmotivated. He seemed like he didn't like me too much. I was like, "If you score 2 goals, I'll do 50 push-ups. If you don't, you have to do 50 push-ups." Said in front of the whole team, and everyone's like, "Ooh, you gotta do it." He did score 2 goals. He scored off his first shot, missed every other shot, scored on his last shot. I did the push-ups, but the culture was high in that moment. But there's another kid who's not gonna score goals. He was a fullback. He nut I'm sorry. He nutmeg turns to me and says, "If I do it again, can I get Chick-fil-A?" It was the most disrespectful thing I've ever
Oh,
seen.
yeah.
I subbed him off immediately, and I just, like, tore him to pieces. I was like, "You never treated an opponent like that. That's so disrespectful. Wow, if you ever treat, like, an opponent like that again, you'll never play for me." And then this kid cries. I was like, "Oof." Like, I was
Yeah.
like, "Man, did I do it a little bit too much? Like, did I crack the whip a bit too hard?" So it's interesting that you're talking about, trying to have, like, a light mood and making jokes, and also finding the balance of, like, when you crack the whip and how hard you crack it and the setting and the timings. I find that to be interesting for sure. Going in a slightly different direction, you were talking about having fewer resources. I know is a topic that you may want to talk about. I had a, background in mobile personal training, so you have some power blocks, and you have to get really creative with the client, but you have an even more difficult constraint, I find, because you have 25 kids, like you say. Even if you have a nice weight room,
Yeah.
you have only so many trap bars, so many plates, so many benches, so many dumbbells. How do you manage that, both in terms of dividing the focus among so many kids and then also equipment, flow, all those things?
Yeah, so I mean that became like an abundant need in COVID. We were very fortunate to on the high school side keep the school open, and because our hockey team is elite and we have a lot of kids moving on to higher divisions, we have to keep them moving, and we basically had to figure out some way to get all of them training. Now, granted, at this time, no one else is playing sports. We're playing sports, but we're training. We're only allowed in the basketball gym, so no weights because you can't touch anything. You have to clean everything, right? And for context, our gym is like, I don't know, 20. Let's just say a 20 by 25 rectangle or something like that. With I always call it 1.5 squat racks. We have a power rack. We have an actual, so 2.5 squat racks and a Smith machine. We have dumbbells 5 to 80. We have like 5 bars. We have trap bars. So there's not enough to go around for everyone. So we have to become very what's the right word? We just have to be able to optimize our flow and utilization of resources. So before we get to that, COVID can't touch any of that stuff. So we're in the gym. We have to wear masks. We're spending a boatload of time jumping over hurdles. We have cones, we have hurdles, and we have space. So it required me to be very industrious with my approach. And that's where a lot of things started to like a lot of barriers in my understanding of application
Mhm.
started to I guess I don't know if the right word is break down or evolve because I started to recognize connections between the application of force and direction, magnitude, how well we can apply certain movements to obtain a particular adaptation without the utilization of external load. I started to be able to justify and understand the development of agility and speed in constrained space in the utilization of gamified drills to enhance these properties. So I was like, oh, okay, if we can do all of this with some hurdles and some cones, like what are we going to be able to do once we get back in the gym? And sure enough, next year rolls around, we go from this big old double basketball gym back into this 20 by 25 room. And you're like, oh boy, right? It didn't seem as bad before, but now it's bad,
Uh,
and I'm at this point, 5 years into coaching and slowly recognizing these stark contrasts between types of athletes
mhm.
and how they're anthropometrically predisposed to certain movement strategies, why that skinny, lanky, springy guy doesn't like doing this particular movement was beyond me, but now I'm starting to understand, okay,
Yeah.
we don't have access to that external rotation. We can't get deep. Okay, so now how can I can't just give one program to everyone because it's not working.
Right.
And we talk about those flashy guys, those guys and gals with the big, the big heads and the big characters. They're oftentimes are really good players. At least in
Mhm.
hockey, you see this all the time. The 5-star commit kid is in equal parts the best player on the ice, in equal parts an asshole in the gym. It just happens all the time. Sorry if this is a child friendly
No, no, you're
podcast.
good.
So then it's like, okay, I can't give this singular program to this kid and this kid working out at the same time. Let's also remember the constraints of biological and chronological age differences, rates of maturity. We have some kids that are still pre peak height velocity versus other ones that are
Mhm.
post height peak height velocity. They're done growing, some are still growing. Some are 6'4" and 15 years old, and some are 5'8" and 18 years old. So
Mhm.
this necessity of having to provide some form of individualization or specificity came as a result of small space, minimal resources, and people are just getting piled up. Buddy's over here like, I haven't even done my second exercise because everyone's on the single bench that we have.
Mhm.
So, solution then becomes how can we allocate exercises based on their anthropometric and force characteristics? So, if we know an athlete is predisposed to not having deep range of motion,
Mhm.
and we need to get them stronger bilaterally, we're going to go with a trap bar. We're going to go
Mhm.
with a pin or a box squat, something that is going to atone for their lacking range of motion or access. And we're going to supplement that with a complementary movement for improving mobilization. Maybe it's just a hip opener or something like that. And then, so now we have one group that lacks range of motion. We have another group that has great range of motion. And then we're looking at the force characteristics. Okay, how are we going to apply that as well? And then we have a middle ground, someone that's, an underdeveloped elastic or underdeveloped muscular athlete. So we have
Mhm.
three groups now. How we now select exercises would allow us to check the box of the global need of the team. We all need to get stronger. So we're all going to hit some form of bilateral strength movement. But due to their anthropometric predispositions, we're going to give them certain movements that work for them better. So we have a split stance squat, we have a trap bar deadlift, and we have a back squat. Now, effectively, what we've done is we've 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 thirded we've cut our resources in thirds. We now have a third of the group working in the squat rack. We have a third in the hallway using heavy dumbbells, and we have a third using trap bars. So
Mhm.
effectively, we've enhanced our flow, tenfold. We don't have people clogging up. We have people of similar builds and force qualities working together, competing together, not feeling like they're being out competed because they're working with people that are better at that movement than themselves. And we do this. I do this filtering down through everything to just allow less cloggage, right? We have the same idea. If we have a global team need, even if it's not anthropometrically allocated to them based on how they move or how they're built, we're still splitting things up to attack in a different sense. So we
So
could have single arm landmine press, we could have a single arm dumbbell press, and we could have a single arm floor press. It's all going to be some form of horizontal single arm press. We're just reaching the end goal from a different path. That's probably the shortest form way I can explain that. It started with COVID, as many things did, and
Uh,
it's led to this system that allows me to really hammer down the needs while meeting the needs and demands of the sport and the team.
So the way that I have like a similar and different way of going about that is like I'll train a lot of couples. They'll have different injury history, they'll have different builds, they'll have different capabilities, and then you give them similar templates. Sometimes I will give them totally different workouts, but generally it's the same template, going for the same adaptations through different means. So it might be somebody like right now. I have they're not actually a couple; they're two buddies. I think it'd be funny to suggest they were a couple, but anyway, they're two 6'4" guys, 40s, 50s, about 220, big strong guys, and all that. One has knee issues, and the other one has like shoulder and neck issues. And so one can do certain exercises, overhead movements just fine, and the other one wouldn't be able to. The other one can do, heavy deep squats if we just have it not, front rack or something like that or front loaded. And then the other one, he might have to do lunges or something like that. And so I understand within that individual context, I think it's nice that you're able to look into these categories to help with the allocation of equipment. I've had conversations similar to determining the needs of athletes, and this is kind of where I want to go with it is how much do you give them of what they're already good at versus what they need? And then also what you're good at has to do with buy-in. But then the other thing too is we're talking about Steve already. Steve and I had this conversation talking about the soft skills and hard skills of training. And so he said he was like the hard side of things where he would be super strong and do all the grindy stuff, but then now he's doing a lot of skipping and crawling and trying to be very loose. I find that I always gravitate more towards the loose, flowy sort of stuff. I always like the coordination based stuff. I have a heavy bag. That's my thing now. When I was a player, I like doing a lot of ball work, but I don't love being underneath a super heavy barbell all the time. I have to like mentally prep for it, give myself a few slaps. So I would benefit from doing more of the hard stuff. He'd benefit from doing more of the soft stuff. But then I also had Brendan McGuigan on the podcast, and he was talking about how he does some college programming virtually
Mm,
um, as a favor to one of his old college coaches. And he says he has to categorize people by, you know, force driven versus elastic driven versus force deficient, all these different things. It
mm.
sounds like that's essentially what you do. But then we're also talking about culture and buy-in. Is there ever a time where you give somebody something that they need and they just absolutely hate it? So you have to find a way to tweak it. That balance between what they need versus what they're good at.
Okay, great question. I'll try and answer it in a couple different ways because this is something that I consider from a multiple different scopes. First and foremost, yeah, very similar to Brandon. I actually want to have him on to have a chat
Great.
as well.
He's
It's
great.
great. But yeah, force deficient, like it depends on the time of the year. Sometimes I go to 5 groups where we have force deficient, elastic, hybrid, muscular, and we have eccentric deficient during in season where we can kind of really manipulate those smaller variables of a wants, needs, and what they associate well with. So why I'm telling you that is because that is a consideration I do make. Once I've gotten the athletes in, we go through a conventional GPP block. They are comfortable with the type of training we're going to do. We've grandfathered some things in from the year prior, and then we allocate them to their groups based on their initial and routine force plate data. And then as everyone's become comfortable, maybe this is after December break, we branch into these more specific groups to really narrow in what they need from a psychological and a physiological standpoint. It's
Mhm.
in season. We're not going to add too much novelty. We kind of want to narrow in on what is it that this particular athlete needs and can handle at this time of year, but
Right.
then more precisely, what can we give them based on what they associate well with?
Mhm.
That goes back to a bit of that three group I was talking about in exercise allocation based on resources and needs. But how someone associates with a movement is a critical consideration because even if anthropometrically they're built to be a deep squatter, but like you said or yourself, you don't like being under heavy load or you don't like deal well with compressive forces, then why am I going to put someone in that position, right? So it's that uphill battle of now I'm disregarding the person that's in front of me and I'm trying to forego what their needs are from a psychological standpoint and just try and put my own needs in there. And that's not how things work. So how are we going to solve that problem? It's a conversation. If you're privy to having a couple years with that person, then it's like you should know by then what they like or don't like. But like I said, it's just about meeting the final needs with the means in which match the demands of their sport or the
Mhm.
session. So how do I go about it? I mean, most of the time you'll see associations, clear associations between the type of athlete they are, their force characteristics, and the exercises that they enjoy doing. And it just makes sense. I would assume you're probably more of a narrow ISA athlete who doesn't really like compressive forces.
Mhm.
So, it makes total sense to me. Disliking something is most of the time related to the fact that there's a lack of confidence or a discomfort with it. That's totally fine. So I just track back to the statement of we're just going to meet the needs with the means in which associate with the demands.
It's interesting. I like that perspective because at the end of the day, it's all about adaptation. And this is another conversation I want to have with you. You made the post recently about the bicep curls, where you're talking about does it really matter pronated versus supinated versus neutral grip? Does it matter if it's easy bar dumbbells? Does it matter if it's 12 reps, 20 reps? Does it matter any of these things if the intent is lacking? And at the end of the day, I think this is something that coaches can definitely learn. And I'm starting to hear this conversation more commonly very recently. But I find forever, like you were saying in the beginning, is the same for me. You want to get all the letters, you want to find the perfect sets, reps, all the details. And the details are actually not irrelevant, but they're not nearly as important as understanding what the person wants, like you're talking about, not forcing a square peg into a round hole, that whole thing. But then also just consistency, effort. Intent is so huge. And if we think backwards, you almost work with like the end in mind and we think, what is the adaptation we want? What is a good stress that we can apply? Then it doesn't matter if it's a hammer curl or a cable curl or easy bar curl or something like that. And then you just gotta like rip it. Sometimes it's good to do like you say, we just go until you can't. I like when clients have accidental cluster sets.
Mm,
So that means that we have intent. I like situations like that where it's like I tell someone, I'll give them a range. We'll do 6 to 8. They hit 5, and then they still want to do 3 or something like that. I'm like, that's cool because that means that like you're not. No one just does 50% effort, does 5, takes a break, and does 3. If you do, that's weird. Or I like when people get the shakes or something like that. So sometimes, even just with coaching intensities, I try to tell people in languages that they can understand. I don't want to talk RP, RIR, anything like that. So I'll just explain essentially those concepts. I'll say, how hard was it 1 to 10? But they'll only know what 10 is if we ever hit failure. Sometimes I
mm,
give it to them on a safe exercise. We're not going to do failure on a back squat, for example, with no safeties, no spotter, because that's really stupid. But push-ups, for example, is pretty darn safe to hit failure. So you give someone something like that, and then you just ask them, once they start to know how many more reps they could have done, you say, how many more do you think you could do? And then you make your jumps based off that. They say 5 reps, you add a little bit more weight than you would say if they say they could do 2 more reps, if that's really what you where you want them to be. But I tell them, like, if you start shaking or your final reps slow down, that's where I want to be on almost every single set. It may not be sustainable to like hit failure on every set, every workout, forever, of course, especially if you're trying to hit certain velocities and you wanna have a little pop and sprint, sure, that's where the nuance comes into play, but I have some clients where I tell them I try to be nice coach Matt the first month or 2. They get
mm.
into the groove, all that stuff. If they've been sedentary for 10, 20 years, I don't wanna make them pass out the first session. Then we crank it up very gradually, but then there's other people where it's like, "Listen, we gotta get results. It's me and coach Matt time, I want you to shake," all that good stuff. So, I definitely want you to speak to where did this idea come from originally for you, talking about adaptation at over details, and then how do you try to communicate that to your athletes?
Yeah, the idea came from just being exhausted from these kids constantly under training and not understanding what intent is. I'm just like, that's my polite way of being completely fed up. It's just, it's crazy to me how there's an ideology amongst a lot of young athletes, particularly in the hockey space, that you don't train in season or training is going to make you slow, it's going to make you sore, et cetera, et cetera. And while it's logical in some aspect because they can associate with a previous session where they went hard on legs and then all of a sudden they couldn't skate the next day, they just do not, they lack the understanding that if you do prolonged exposure to a stimulus, you actually just get used to it. Right. So, with that fundamentally lacking that understanding, they always undershoot everything, which is effectively just lazy stress, if you will. You're just
Mhm,
adding load onto your body. You're doing a little bit more than baseline, and you're just accumulating stress, which is going to result in more injury likelihood than you would otherwise. But
mhm,
so, where this idea comes from is like, I just want to showcase the fact that you don't have to necessarily follow that 3 by 15. If you watch a lot of high quality bodybuilders, they'll post what they did for the day. They'll do their 3 by 10, but their 3 by 10 resulted in 10 reps, pronated. Then they went to a supinated grip. Then they went to a reverse grip and they went to failure basically on that. So they're resulting in mechanical failure of the muscle that they're trying to enhance, right? So they're viewing this as, okay, the stimulus I'm trying to reach is something just short of failure, which is going to result in the best adaptive stimulus.
mhm.
That's their goal. So if we just apply that to a sporting framework where we do have more complexity or I should say more diversity in the exercises within our structure and they have different reasons. Like bodybuilding, maybe we're just looking for hypertrophy, so all of them are treated the same. Whereas in sports performance, we have that high force, human force work, fast force at the beginning, where the idea is to express as fast as we possibly can, to inhibit, to respond, be reflexive. Then we go into strength where we're trying to stress either the central nervous system or we're trying to add or enhance morphological or structural change. And then we go into our higher volume peripheral fatiguing stuff. So that's a lot to manage. But when it comes to chasing a particular stimulus, the stimulus is the ultimate northern star. That's, as you said, that's what we're chasing. And a lot of times when people, particularly athletes, fall victim to just staying between those two lines of, oh, there's my 3 sets, there's my 10 reps, there's my 30 reps, I've got the volume. But as I go back to, that's just accumulating stress without adequate intent. So we apply open sets, accumulate 40 reps, right? I've seen it with the back squat, with the deadlift, with the bench. When we do this, finally are like, oh, yeah, this actually works, because it's like you're doing this much intensity, 72% of your 1 RM. We're going to load that up on the bar after your warm up, and you're going to complete 40 reps. And they do 12, and they do 8, and they do 4, and then they're doing singles. And the reality is what we've done is we've forced them to effectively reach peri failure without overshooting or undershooting volume. We've matched the volume that we need, and we've matched the intensity just by keeping them exactly where they need to in terms of the load on the bar. Can we always do this? No, because it takes a lot of time. But athletes listening or coaches that want to apply open sets, it's just a very effective way to accumulate high intent volume without, undershooting yourself. Because people psychologically, I got to do 5 sets of 6 reps. Like, that's really long. I got to rest 2 minutes. But it's like, all right, if you got to do 30 reps and they're fresh, and this is another element with open sets, is you can modulate intensity based on freshness and preparedness. If you're fresh, maybe you bang out 15 and 15. You're having a day. And then another time you just played a couple games on the weekend, had to sleep in a hotel, have a long day, and we got to lift the next day, and you end up doing 5 sets of 6. We've still accumulated the same volume, and we've matched the intent. It's just we've done it a little bit differently.
So I find that one of the strategies that I learned early on that was very productive was a double progression. It kind of just gave a person an option to either progress in terms of volume or to progress in terms of intensity. For anybody not listening, if I give a rep range of, let's say we want to do strength, let's say 3 to 5, we want to get kind of that middle range, we'll do 5 to 8, or we do more hypertrophy, say 8 to 12. You tell somebody, pick a weight that you can only do, let's say 3 to 5, 3 reps. You stick with that weight until you can hit 5 reps. And once you can hit 5, you go up and wait again and try to hit 3, and you just keep doing this forever. If someone actually applies that properly, then there's always some sort of intent and stimulus driven behind it. They keep trying to increase the rep or increase the weight. And sometimes, if you just say, I'm only going to do 3 reps, and you try to add 5 pounds, you might have that weird middle ground where you can't make that jump, or it's mentally defeating. So you kind of give people a little bit of wiggle room there. But the other thing too is we're talking about double progression. I like giving people sometimes periods where they can try to add more density. So you say we're going to do triples on deadlifts. We're going to set a timer for 10 minutes. How many sets can you accumulate? And then it's almost auto regulation in that sense. On a fresher day, they might do more triples. There's just sometimes I find giving some autonomy is a way that you can actually get people to have some level of intent and almost challenge themselves. But then also talking about the end in mind, I think it's so important to stress the purpose of every single drill. And I also tell like the kid, for example, I was like, hey, like you're giving me 70% effort. That's enough to make you tired, but it's not enough to make you better. So what's the point? I was like, might as well give 100% effort. If we're going to do a sprint, at 80% sprint, maybe is technical work, maybe get some capacity there, but you're not actually going to be training the nervous system at a very high level to really increase your velocity over time. Same thing with if you're doing a throw, don't throw it hard, throw it hard as fuck. That's what Dustin LaBelle would say. If you're doing a jump, hit your head on the ceiling, but all these things, it's like, and sometimes you have like the timing gates or like the OVR, jump system, like that's good because then it gamifies it and all that, but there's just got to be ways that you find it competitive. I definitely have had to get creative. If someone's in a landmine push press, I tell them I want to hear the bar rattle every single time. When it doesn't rattle anymore, we're not training very explosively. Maybe we're going too heavy, or maybe we're just not driving enough force. I find that I would imagine you've definitely had to find strategies like that or ways to communicate to athletes to know if they're actually getting a clean rep versus a lazy rep.
Yeah, for sure. And it is one of my gripes because it's tough because where my mind goes is I understand that they're humans, and then especially high school students, like sometimes they don't have the prerequisite energy to rip that bar, you know what I mean? But at the same time, for the most part, we see in a lot of these velocity sessions, all these kids are always talking about, I want to get fast, I want to have foot speed, I want to be speedy, I want to be this, I want to be powerful, okay? And then we go through the educational part of recognizing that it takes high velocity movements, it takes a great deal of intent and intentional movement of the external object And it doesn't have to be heavy, but it takes that massive degree of intent to actually generate some form of adaptation. Strength work, a little bit easier, load some heavy stuff up, you move to the capacity at which you can, we're probably going to get strength gains. But when it comes to those ballistics, throwing things, we're talking about Olympic lifts, if we're talking about jumps, plyometrics, hops, like you can't just complete the work. And that's like, I can't stand that. They're just hopping around on one foot. It's like, you gotta, like you said, put your head through the ceiling. I want you to treat the floor like it's lava. There's a nail on your foot. You gotta get off the ground, right? Because otherwise we're not creating the prerequisite deformation of the structures to get any sort of adaptation. I mean, ways I go about it, it's always a bit difficult when you're 25. I'm navigating, I'm going through the room, and just that's a good time to get a little one-on-one touch point. It's like
Mhm.
beginning of the session we're going through. Later in the year, we know enough exercises that I'll pick 2 or 3 things that I'm going to be my coaching touch points for the day. Depth jumps and drop jumps. Even though it's March and we've touched on it every week, basically, they still don't seem to understand what the difference is. Demonstrate, show the difference, talk about little cues and feelings in the body of like, okay, it's a depth jump. We're going to forego a little bit of the time that takes to get off the ground for some jump height. All right. Feel free to use your arms, reach, look for something. Drop jump, we're looking for the shortest amount of ground contact possible. Pre-tense your calves and your ankle complex. Think about attacking that ground. Get off as quick as you possibly can. If you hear something from your feet hitting the ground, that's excellent indication. If you have exhalation when you're jumping, that's another great way to know that you've jumped or thrown or lifted hard enough. Yeah, those are just some of mine.
There's definitely, 2 directions I wanna go with this. One of them is I wanted to go back a little bit to when you're talking about having access to the weight room versus not. 'Cause you're talking about hops and all that stuff. I'm sure that you talked about some of the things you had to do. I'm sure it was a lot of plyometrics, a lot of speed and agility, a lot of conditioning, a lot of isometrics, a lot of calisthenics, because, of course, you can be limited in terms of equipment. I'm curious if you noticed that you could still get your athletes very athletic with just those means and foregoing certainly the higher force, or intensity things like, squatting, deadlifting, benching, and all that stuff. So I definitely want you to speak to that, but then also we're talking about the way that you coach exercises makes such a big difference, and I find that if you can explain to somebody how it translates to the ultimate goal, for me, for example, I don't lift purely because I like lifting, I like because it helps me prepare for a certain sporting task or life task. So when I'm doing sandbag work for something like that, I think about grappling, and it makes
Mm.
it like a strong connection, even though I know I could just do a back squat and strong legs and all that, sure. But I always try to think about how will this one thing that I'm doing right now help me in a different context. And I try to communicate that to athletes. I say, for example, if you can hop, then maybe you can produce more force through one foot, which translates to sprinting, for example. So that's definitely one of the things. But then I've also heard some people demonize exercises purely because they can't coach it properly. I've heard people say they don't do step ups because people push off the bottom leg and then they only get the tension on the top half of the step up. And it's like, okay, well, can you give them a constraint like putting a small plate underneath their heel so that they can't push their toes through the ground and they almost have to do like a single leg squat to raise themselves up? Or can you just communicate that right in the first place? You're talking about how you use like the nail on the ground or something like that, or the lava. I tell clients sometimes when they're doing step downs, reach with the heel, and then imagine your dog's tail's on the ground. You want to touch it, but you don't want to hurt them.
Yeah.
Or like there's a plastic cup and you want to touch it, but you don't want to smush it, something like that. And I find analogies have been a very successful way to coach things as well. So I definitely wanted to talk about that, but I think I'd rather go, if you're comfortable with it, in the direction of the differences between the minimalist way of training as opposed to having, in theory, access to a full weight room.
Yeah, I mean, other than the obvious, I would go on to say that, like, from a minimalist standpoint, you get to have a greater exposure to movement literacy. You
Mhm.
get to get them into weird shapes. You force them to do the calisthenics, the human force stuff, to crawl, to jump. You have to be creative, of course, but like I go back to what I was saying about understanding the justification of using these exercises. You start to recognize that there is a high degree of applicability to building athleticism
Mhm.
through just doing fundamental close style agility work, side
Mhm.
steps, drop steps, karaoke, that sort of stuff, all the way up to doing some form of open sided cone game. The one issue we run into is there's a lot of wear and tear involved with it, right? Especially
Mhm.
in the context in which I was in, where it's like constantly on a hardwood gym floor. We dismiss a lot of time because there's not a high external load, that there's not a lot of internal load. And the reality
Mhm.
is when we're doing high degrees of plyometrics, repeat plyometrics, the penta broad jump. Think about how much force is being exuded there, right? And in conjunction with playing a lot of games, a lot of cutting, lots of D cells, A cells, we're exposing our bodies to a lot of force.
Mhm.
And when you don't have the development of the musculature in conjunction, we end up resulting in a few more soft tissue related injuries. And
Mhm.
that's what we were seeing a little bit more. So yeah, we were getting in, we were very well conditioned. We were definitely a lot faster and a lot springier, if you will. But we were seeing a lot of soft tissue
Mhm.
injuries as well, versus when you have access to the high degree of resources that we have in the gym, then we can now target the same qualities that we're looking for. We're still developing speed. We got them sprinting. Have them moving in multi-directional planes, but we can reinforce these high internal stressors with some more external peripheral loads and stress. I don't know if that answers it appropriately.
I think it does. I think this also gets into a similar topic, which I find is very important. When I first started coaching, I thought you just have to prepare them for the demands of the sport, and that's true. But once they get into their sporting season, you can't give them too much of that because they're already getting a lot of the demands from the sport itself. So you almost have to go in a different direction to keep them healthy, like you're saying. If they're on the ice a lot, or they're on the field a lot, or something like that, and then you're giving them lots of sprinting and cutting and jumping, and they're already doing that, then it could lead to overuse injuries. It could lead to soft tissue injuries, like you're talking about, to the groin, hamstring, calf, whatever it may be. And so, for example, I told you about the kid that I'm helping rehab. Right now, it's a lot of weight room stuff just to becoming, very resilient. And we can kind of go in a slight different direction. I have an issue with physical therapy, the traditional sense, getting to like 80% and then saying, okay, you're cleared for play, but they got hurt at 100%. So
Yeah.
there's still a 20% gap at 100% when they're hurt. I want to get them to 120% so they're more resilient, so they don't get that injury in the first place. In this instance, it was a contact injury, so it's a bit different, but still, we got to get really, really strong so that we can handle contact a bit better. Um, but so there's definitely that whole divide. But then the other thing too is they're trying to rush him back into games as quickly as possible. I understand it's his passion. He doesn't like the weight room, doesn't want to be here. That's fine. But I want to have time with him to start with increasing the distances of acceleration to get into more top speed stuff. So he doesn't pull anything. I want his cuts to gradually get more aggressive over time. So maybe do a 135-degree cut, then 90-degree cut, then maybe you can do like a true 180-degree cut or whatever. Do you know what I mean? But like starting with the more shallow cut into a deeper cut, all sorts of different things. I want to get some curvilinear running. I want to get harder shuffles. I want to make it more change of direction into agility to make it more chaotic. I want him to jump up and get shouldered and have to land awkwardly and be able to take care of that. All this to say that once he gets back into playing with his team, if we get him resilient enough and he's healthy and all that stuff, I find that I can't give him more field work on top of the field work he'd have with his team. And that's where I find that doing the gym work would be more important so that you can get the human side of things as opposed to purely athletic prep. You can get into the just human healthy stuff, fill the buckets that aren't being filled otherwise. Because if he's going to be sprinting a bunch and conditioning a bunch, but he gets very low exposure to high force, high intensity movements, maybe we just focus on some of the heavy strength stuff or something like that. I'm curious how you periodize in that sense between balancing between the athlete versus the human health perspective.
That's a great question. And I'm going to try and answer. There's a lot of little things in there that spark some interest for me. So first, I think I'll speak on top. I'll speak on the more holistic thing here, which I view as like this idea that we can't dose them with certain things at certain times of the years. Now, I'll
Mhm,
be careful what I say because there's two ways that we go about this.
mhm,
There is the one way in which we don't want to overly dose them things that they're already getting dosed with. So, like you said, if we're let's just say we're talking with a basketball player, if they're getting a high degree of D cells and A cells on the court, lots of change of direction, lots of time on the hardwood floor. No, I don't think dosing them with that sort of stimulus is a good thing all the time because then we're just doubling up on the stress.
mhm,
But if we're talking about stress itself and trying to avoid a lot of stress or a lot of load, I don't always agree with that. If you it depends on your cohort, your age, and your playing level. If we're talking about what I'm working with, some younger, more plastic athletes, these young kids that are basically living steroids, I view it the other way around, where yes, they have a high demand on the ice, they have a high demand in their social life, their school, in their playing schedule, but we have a unique window of time where we can allocate enough stress to them that they
mhm,
can supercompensate at a much greater degree. So for me, this was a bit of a shock for my interns, but this has worked for us for years where instead of coming into the season in September and just doing a quick little GPP and getting into in season of 8, 9 months, I prolong our preseason well into the first quarter
mhm,
of season where we're just pushing, pushing, pushing because we have forced breaks. And as a result of that forced December break where we have 2.5 weeks off, we're getting getting that fitness and stress way, way up there. Forced break. I know they're not going to train as hard, but they're just going to touch the weights a little bit. Boom, super compensation. We float right into the end of the season. And now we're seeing our best jumps. We're most physically prepared, and we're just absolutely dominating teams in the third period. So from a stress standpoint, I think it's important to recognize, where they are in the long-term athletic development pathway, how old they are, training tenures, speed of the game, all that sort of stuff. Because in some contexts, I think it's important to continue dosing them with high degrees of stress. But in the context of 1-to-1, if we're talking about, high decel and a high decel, we're probably just going to leave the sport for that
Mhm.
quality, reinforced with other things in the gym.
So I think this is interesting 'cause we can go in so many different directions with this. One of them is also some people won't touch, like, plyometrics or sprinting at all in season, thinking
Mhm.
they get enough of that from the sport, but you might never actually hit a true 100% sprint or jump in a sporting context.
Yeah.
So there is actually you don't need a lot of stimulus to maintain a quality. So even just for maintenance purposes, doing a little bit of sprinting and jumping at the highest intensities could be helpful,
Mhm.
during the season, but then also going in a different direction. There's this huge talk, it was a big thing a while ago, minimal effective dose, and then some people are like, "Well, what about maximal effective dose?" And I think there's a time and place for both.
Yeah.
What you're talking about up until that break, maximal effective dose is definitely the goal, and you also have to understand within the individual how much can they tolerate, but
Yeah.
that's something I look for sometimes with people. Of course, time of year depends on how I go about it, but it's almost like, what is the most stress it can possibly apply to you that you can tolerate? And then that's how you make progress the fastest, so long as you don't physically, mentally, emotionally break down, right? But then that's where you go a little bit too far. The other thing too is it also comes into the context of, do they need more skill work? Or do they need more just physical capabilities? Because sometimes people break down physically because their skill work the demands of the skill work exceed what they're physically capable of. So you see a lot of like pitchers where their arms are just totally shot because they're
Mhm.
pitching, 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 and their shoulders are too weak to tolerate the velocities for the volume that they're doing. And what would make them a better pitcher is to get more pitches, in theory, but only if they can tolerate and not break down in that moment. So I had Mike Carroll, Fit for Golf, on the podcast earlier, and he was talking about how one thing he's very curious now is how much skill work can you survive? That might be the separator, and that might be why you have some elite athletes or just the people you're talking about that can tolerate stress better. They might just be like a survivorship bias that maybe
Mhm.
everybody's trying to have this high level of skill work, and just these people were able to survive the forces that the demands were there, right? You look at Messi, for example, and maybe he just had a good balance, but like one of the things that made him one of the greatest players of all time is he has a tremendous injury record in the sense that he hasn't missed a lot of games throughout his entire career, and that's almost one of the greatest skills. I would almost argue that availability is the best
It is.
ability in that sense, but it's almost like he's talking about golf. If you go to the range or you use speed sticks or something like that, how hard can you crank a golf club over and over and over again, and how does that stimulus apply to improving as an athlete? So I definitely find this to be a very interesting subject because you also look at, I picked up Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu recently as I retired from soccer and I had no other sports and I wanted to have something. I went into that direction. You look at the Thai fighters and their schedules, and it's insane. I mean, they'll do a 5K run and then skip for 30 minutes, and then hit the bag for 30 minutes, and then pads for 30 minutes, and then spar for 30 minutes, and then maybe finish with shadow boxing for 30 minutes. It's just so much strain on the body. And then they do it, 5, 6 days a week. And they'll fight frequently. Professional fighters in different sports might get 30 fights in their career, and some Thai fighters will have hundreds of fights. So it's definitely an interesting context. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the balance between skill and physical tolerance. But
For
yeah.
sure, for sure. Well, I'll just make a blanket statement here where it's like most people don't understand what the upper limits are. They really
Uh-huh.
don't. Most people get into what feels uncomfortable and then they pull away, right? And it just takes knowing a martial artist or someone in the fighting space to recognize like what actual true volume and intensity is,
Mhm.
right? Like these people are dogs. They're going in there to fight and kill basically, and they're preparing for that, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not taking yourself to a place that is akin to you know the limits of your capacity, if you can't find it, like you should be welcoming to find your limits of your
Mhm.
capacity. Typically we view that as the biological breakdown and injury, but if we can get right up to that line, that's where adaptation exists. So I implore people to actually start training hard, and that goes back to the whole open set video where it's like just chase the stimulus, chase what you're trying to get. That's mechanical failure in this circumstance. Find that. When you find that, now you'll have actual results versus just accumulating stress. And to talk on the technical, tactical, or not tactical, the technical skill versus like physical development. I mean, this has a huge implication on the development of young athletes. And while part of me wishes to stray away from the conversation of sports specificity, that's a huge marker of a lacking development of young athletes in the space where there's an overemphasis of developing. There's all these camps, there's all these
Mhm.
sport position or sport specific coaches. I got to work on this element and that element. And there's this oversaturation of skill development without the prerequisite development of physical capacity. That really, it's not even prerequisite, it's more in conjunction. They should be
Mhm.
working in parallel to complement each other.
Mhm.
Now, I'll try and tie this all together because when you mention Messi, it's interesting because Messi and a lot of these outlier athletes, once again, it goes back to those guys that I see on the team all the time. They're extremely skilled, but they're allergic to the gym. Why is that? And that's one of those nuances that we as coaches have to be aware that with those outliers, because they are outliers,
Mhm.
we have to just dose them with what they need to continue being who they are.
Mhm.
But they are outliers. We are not outliers, so we have to work in within certain silos that allow us to maximize our ceiling and our floor. With a high skill player, it's more about quality preservation. A very low skill player, it's about realizing skill development and then trying to help them guide their capacities of skill through physical capacity. And then the rank and file, most of the people between those two extremes, it's about finding a healthy balance between the two. And dosing it in response to what they need in this particular time. But absolutely, skill is while it sits at the top. I always have a pyramid. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I show
Mhm.
my athletes that sports number one. Like if we're working with athletes, sports number one. If you don't have this prerequisite skill or the capacity to play from a technical or tactical standpoint, you're going to have a hard time. Lack of technical and tactical knowledge results in, putting yourself in precarious situations where the physical capacities that you currently have might be challenged, and you're probably going to find that limit that we speak of. If your body's not able to hand it, you lack the strength and force characteristics necessary to compete in the sport. And if you're lacking in that area, it's probably because you have some form of energy system development issue. And there's your pyramid, right? But it all filters back to sport where if we don't have that skill, while it's not the end all be all, really, if we don't have all of it, we're going to fall apart at some point in the chain. Skill ultimately important, but the development of physical capacities in conjunction is important all the way around.
So it's interesting that Messi being an outlier, we talked about survivorship bias. There's a lot of people that will just copy what professional athletes do at different stages of their development, which is a huge pet peeve of mine. It's like, oh, I saw Ronaldo do this. I'm like, oh, Ronaldo's sporty. He's also 6'1", 6'2", and he's like super lean and jacked, and he's been training forever. And you're a 13-year-old noodle, and like you're
Yeah.
being told you need different things right now. But some of these athletes are great despite what they do, not because of what they do, and then athletes will just mimic it without understanding the context. So that's part of it. But then also just between Messi and Ronaldo, they both have amazing longevity. They both have like tremendous injury records, and so as they haven't been injured too much throughout their careers. But then they have totally different approaches to physical development. So which one do we actually look at as the correct answer? You can look at one as just being like a freak situation. One guy was just blessed by God to be so talented and just to stay healthy, and then the other one was very much a product of hard work and professionalism. I would say sometimes he's not very graceful to watch. Of course, Ronaldo.
Yeah.
And yet he just rips the ball as hard as he can or gets himself into great positions over and over and over again, jumps higher than the defender, gets a header, and just is more of an output player in terms of that. But then this is another subject that I find very fascinating. It's almost like what is the definition of athleticism? And what I've come to believe right now is it's just problem solving or the ability to learn. And so we're talking about Messi. He might be able to solve a problem with skill and intelligence, and as opposed to just sheer athleticism. And then you have a Ronaldo who might need maybe has less skill, maybe has less intelligence, so he finds a solution through physicality. But then we get into the concept of I had this conversation a little bit with Mike Carroll as well. Do you wanna be that super technical golfer who's weak as shit, or do you wanna
Mm.
be the power lifter who can't hit the ball? It's like you can work both sides to improve your golf game. Of course, if you're super strong and super fast, but you can't connect with the ball properly, it makes no difference. But also, why would you say, "Oh, I'm just this skillful guy, skill no" see it in jiu-jitsu all the time too. There's this myth that, like, size doesn't matter, strength doesn't matter,
Mm.
and that, skill and all it's huge, it matters so, so much, but then also, I'd much rather be really, really strong and be an idiot who doesn't know something about jujitsu than really, really weak and an idiot who doesn't know anything about jujitsu. So there's definitely that balance between everything that you're talking about in the chain there. Is there anything that you've changed your mind on recently or something that really stands out from your career that you wanna share? And kind of along those lines, is there anything that you're curious to continue learning about at this stage of your career?
Yeah, this is one of those questions that kind of stumps me a little bit because there's plenty of things like
Mhm.
I'm a very introspective person. Maybe that's where the direction I'll go. I think unraveling the need for introspection has been game changing for me. And introspection being just effectively asking myself why.
Mm,
And why am I doing this? Why do I have this bias? And what that's been able to do is just kind of peel back my biases, make me recognize that, oh, I was doing this because of this, and I learned this, and this made me feel comfortable. What am I not good at? And then just being able to reverse engineer everything that I've done, and then taking that step to taking other people's stuff and putting myself in their shoes and being like, why did you do this? You know, why would you choose that exercise instead of having a front of like, you can't do that? And I was like that when I was a young coach. No, that's bullshit. You can't do that. And now myself using some of those exercises because I have the ability to understand that there's an application for things based on the situation in which we're in. And so finding introspection, I've always been a thinker, but you hit a certain degree of maturity, I believe, that you're able to recognize things within yourself and in others that teaches you a lot of deep rooted lessons and some superficial ones that just help refine your process in general. So I don't know if that's,
it
right
does.
kind.
I kinda wanna go down that a little bit before I go to the second part of that question, which is something that you may be curious about now. But yeah, I've had to go on like this like personal growth journey that's actually really influenced the way that I coach. That it's all interconnected, right? But being curious as opposed to judgmental has been huge. To
Yeah.
not think that you always know everything, to give people the benefit of the doubt. I was very type A and judgmental and black and white and right or wrong and all these different things. To be a little bit more, I don't need to have the answer. I think has been almost like a huge freedom, or maybe this is just an answer, but it's not necessarily the answer has
Right.
been huge. What you're talking about sounds like auditing your program so that you can at least have a justification for everything. But then again, limiting the biases. When I first got started, like I was saying, I wanted to know the answer. And so I'd read one book and I'd be like, this is the answer. And then I would kind of almost be a cultish in that sense where someone says something different, like, no, because I read this one book and that must be, and that's the truth. And then the more I just like allowed almost like these criticisms that you see on the internet, even if they're not directed at you, but you could feel like a personal attack because it goes against what you believe to just be like, "Oh, well, maybe this person has a point," the more I feel I've grown as a coach. So the curiosity and the judgmental thing. The other thing was there's a quote I heard recently that I found to be helpful. It was, the traditional quote is, "If you're the smartest person in the room, then you're in the wrong room," because it's talking
Yeah.
about always but I heard a quote, it was, "If you're the smartest person in the room, then you're an arrogant asshole because you can learn something off anybody if you give them a chance." Like,
Yeah.
there's so much knowledge in the world, you can't possibly know everything. And
Right.
so I just found that, like, nice to be, I guess, less judgmental. And I even did that recently with just training. I got into unconventional training a few years ago because I was like, "Oh, well, if it's not the best thing, then why is it worth doing?" And I
Yeah.
had, Pat Damian on the podcast, and he's an unconventional guy, so, like, kettlebells, maces, sandbags, all that stuff, and he's like, "I do it because I like it,
Yeah.
and the body doesn't know what's in it in the hands, and you can get a stimulus and adaptation from all these things. So even if it's the second best thing as opposed to the best thing for, these details and all that stuff, if I do it consistently with high intent, doesn't matter. I'm still strong, I'm still jacked, I'm still mobile, like, all these different things." I was like it was such a
Yeah.
mind-blowing thing because in sports performance, especially, I find we have this issue where it's all about metrics, maybe to justify your job or whatever, for sales, for whatever. But it's like, "Oh, wow, your jump got 2 inches higher, or your squat, you gained 20 pounds. You still played like shit and you got injured."
Yeah.
But so I definitely find that to I appreciate you saying that because it definitely made me go down this rabbit hole, of course.
Well, I'll add on that quickly. I love what you just said because it's something that I do use all the time with the kids, and they're like, "Oh, it's not as much as it was last time, or should I add more?" Blah blah blah. And it's like, guys, your body does not know what the number is, and for some reason, there's this social construct about what should be on the bar right now, and
Mhm.
you're comparing yourself to others, but your body does not know what's on the bar right now. Your body responds to the stimulus it's put under, and if you want to know if there should be more or less on, if it needs to be less, it's because you couldn't lift it, and
Mhm.
it needs to be more, it's because it was too easy. Simple as that. But I love that. Like your body doesn't know. I wish more people could understand that's just simple picture. And this whole thing of like, I love unconventional. Like I come from a sporting background into CrossFit. Now it's endurance, but I've kind of like been around into
Mhm.
all the different spaces in somewhat on purpose because I want to experience all these things and know
Mhm.
what it feels like. So if I'm working with someone with that kind of background, I can relate. But the unconventional training, it just brings up this topic of conversation that it's like, not does it even matter, but it's like things aren't that deep. And I've had some people I've mentored where they're like, you really like that saying where I'm like, it's not that deep because what we're trying to do, as you just said, is reach a particular stimulus or
Right.
adaptation. And in conjunction with what I said about Who cares what's on the bar? It just matters about the adaptation. If it's a mace, if it's a sandbag, if it's a barbell, if it's another human being,
Mhm.
why does it really matter? And as long as we're getting to that end result. And I just wish that mentality would be adopted a bit more with coaches in particular, because everyone else inherits what they talk about, but more so the athletes. It's like, we're doing this for a particular reason. Put the intent into it, yes, of course, but who cares if Johnny's using a trap bar, you're using a leg press, and this
Mhm.
person's doing a back squat? Who cares? You're using two legs to push that weight as hard as you can, and it's both really it's intense for all three of you, and we're getting stronger.
For
And
sure.
subsequently, it translates over to your sport. But anyways,
The trap bar and the leg press, it's such a small little thing I wanna go down is, it's so interesting how coaching can affect how people do movements and how they feel it. And what I mean to say is that, like, sometimes someone will do a chin up, for example, and they're thinking they're just bicep curling the bar down. And I say, "Well, imagine you're just, like, elbowing the ground or something like that." You know, you're doing like an elbow in UFC, whatever. But I tell people you might feel like the shoulders doing the work more than the elbow, and you might feel your lats working more or something like that. It just by, like, a simple shift and the way that they're thinking about doing the exercise, and then they're like, "Oh, man, I feel a huge difference." Is it placebo? Who cares? Maybe it's real, maybe it's not, but even placebo has some sort of reality to it.
mm,
The other thing too is just getting into the leg press, for like a trap bar deadlift thing is I think when people deadlift versus when they squat, they do it backwards mentally with how they think about it. I think when they squat, they think push the legs down and then they hip hike. And I
mm,
almost say shoulders up, you know, is like the main thing I think about is just try to stay tall throughout the squat. Obviously, depending on it's like a difference between a front squat and a low bar back squat, sure. But then on a deadlift, I almost say just like leg press, and you're naturally going to stand tall, and that
mm,
helps them not hip hiking and pulling with their back, right? I don't want them to pull it off the ground, I want them to drive their legs to the ground. They just stand up. But then on a back squat, I think more stand up as opposed to drive down because if you drive down, you hip hike. So really small, stupid kind of nuance, but there's something to be said about you can tell a real coach from a fake coach if
mm,
they can smell these small little details and explain them. You know they've been in the weight room. You know they've been around. I was watching a video of Britain, right, the old fashioned MMA fighter, the bald
right.
guy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
he was doing, like, this one-hour demonstration talking about his fighting techniques, and he was saying that he would wait for people to exhale to then knee them in the body because they wouldn't be able to tense up as much as when they inhaled.
Yeah.
And it's something that you would only ever know had you, like, been in that field long enough, had you been a true student, a true, practitioner. And so
Mm.
sometimes you see these online coaches, they say different things, it just feels like, the lazy kinda cues that you throw out there, and then you're talking about, some cues, and I'm just like, "Okay, this guy actually knows coaching." You and the way that you explain the different body types or how you divvy up equipment, you would only know that from having had that problem and having solved it. So I know I kinda went on a tangent, but I think a real coach can smell real coach very quickly with something like that. So I don't know if you had similar experiences or not.
Well, for sure. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I have interns come in and
Mhm,
they're in the experiential learning pathway at the university, so I'm getting them as green as they get, right?
mhm,
And the process often starts with initial assessment, like I'm gonna have you shadow me, and I want to see how they interact. Do they hop in right away? Are they a little bit, type A, and they want to be involved, or like they're like, oh shit, what's going on? And then we graduate that into some smaller tasks. Can you do this? Can you do that? Do you pick up weights after the session when no one
mhm,
asked? And then further graduate that into you're going to lead the warm up or a primer exercise. And give me your reasoning why, and then it gets into session, so on and so forth. Why this has pertinence is because I have the opportunity to teach them these nuances that only come from the application or the practical insight that you get from experiencing it, right? So you get these kids green off the ship and you ask them, all right, you're in your fourth year of sports studies and science. Tell me how I should do this session. They write up a session and it's like, okay, well, did you think of this? Did you think of this? Did you think of this? Why'd you put your board on the ground, not put it up here? Why did you have everyone face the mirror? Why not have them face another way? Why did you let them go anywhere they want? Why not have them sit down so they can focus on you? It's like we haven't even touched the exercises yet. But how are you setting yourself up? Why did you demonstrate facing away? Why didn't you use your partner as a form of demonstration? Why are you wearing pants and not shorts? Did you bring a snack? All these sort of things, right? So it's getting them to think that, okay, outside the confines of my textbook, what are all the variables and parameters I have to consider. I have to consider myself. I have to consider them always, first and foremost. I have to consider my environment, the time I have, how I'm communicating, and then I can start dabbling in the exercises. How is this exercise going to interfere with this one? How is it going to interfere with the session flow? What if we have 10 guys doing that same exercise?
mhm.
So it's It's exciting to see them grow. That's the fastest way I see them grow once they start to recognize, okay, I'm going to put most of my effort into dealing with those parameters, and then I'm going to worry if my session is perfect or not, which it never will be, right?
Sure.
Um, I haven't really had a ton of I'm fortunate that I'm the only guy, with the 2 schools I work for and the academies around, which is all nice and for me, but at the same time, I have no support and I don't have a lot of time with other coach to speak on your point. I mean, the coaches I've seen in the sporting coach context, yeah, you can tell when real coaches are real coaches because they know how to connect, they know how to pivot immediately, they know how to hold the room, if you will. And yeah, it's cool to see that at times. Yeah, it's cool to see when someone knows ball, and then other people are just kind of faking it till they make it. But that's my ramble. There you go.
Yep. Let's go in a different direction. What is a major misconception that you wish to dispel? It could be about coaching, it could be about, performance training, whatever kind of realm you want to go down. What's a major misconception you'd wish to dispel?
If some of the guys I train at the junior hockey team hear this, they'll laugh. But that we don't really work much, or we're I don't know, performance staff have an easy life, and it's
Oh,
this
sure.
that there, and it's like, what's that?
Yeah, not sure. I agree with you. Yeah.
It's when we show up, you can call us glorified babysitters. Of course, we have to enact all those soft skills and we have to connect and stuff. But once you have a good culture and you have a cohort who has autonomy, you're not going to be doing a ton. And whether you're working on with personal clients or you're working with large groups, ultimately your goal is to get them to a point where they feel that they can autonomously work. They can answer their own questions. They can complete the workout with intent. And that's a great thing, but at the same time, it can give the off this idea that you're just kind of there, supervising, or you don't have much to do, when a lot of the work happens in the background where it's like I'm looking and collaborating with the coaches. I'm collaborating with the sports med. I am changing my plans constantly because sport coaches are changing their plans. I'm planning well in advance, but also micromanaging from the day to day, and because not one job ever really pays all the bills, we're doing multiple jobs that, you might not see me doing that because I'm only here for 3 hours, but I'm 4 somewhere else and 3 somewhere else. So a misconception is that we're just a bunch of lazy or people with free time. Now, granted, my last thing on that is I'll flip the script a little bit, and there is a bit of this macho approach in a lot of sports performance people who are like, I got to be in the facility at 4:30 a.m. right until midnight, and if you're not grinding, you're not working, and I also don't believe in that. I think we are afforded some degree of flexibility in our lives, and for those that feel like they have to do more and more, I'll speak for myself anecdotally. You don't have to do more and more. Like, find the balance and be content with the flexibility we're given. Just make your time useful.
There's like two things I want to respond with to what you were saying. One is I think it's an Abraham Lincoln quote, but it's something along the lines of, "If I have 4 hours to chop down a bunch of trees, I'll spend 2 hours sharpening my axe." And the idea there is just like the balance. You don't want to hit a bunch of trees with a totally blunt axe. And so there are those people that they talk about, oh, we're underpaid and we're overworked, but then they also will glorify their work, right? And
Yeah,
then not try to find the balance as you're talking about. The other thing too is, yes, we absolutely will work hard, scattered days, early mornings, late nights. For me, I might have 20 sessions a week and people think I might work 20 hours a week, but they're not considering the fact that I commute.
yeah,
Sometimes, 30 minutes there and back, sometimes a little bit more. I have to write programs, I have to do some business stuff, contractual stuff. There's like a lot more that goes into it. So I might have, busy schedules and I don't love every part of the job. I don't love the business side. I became a business owner to be a trainer. I didn't do it to be a business owner. But the other thing too is I feel so fortunate that not everybody gets to enjoy their job and feel that they're making a positive difference and lay their head down at night and feel good about what they do. And even just from the day that I told you I had earlier today, I feel like it was so rewarding to, put smiles on people's faces and have connections. Of course, I work within my skill, but sometimes you become like a pseudo therapist to these people if you work with them long enough, they'll up to you. And it's just like it's really I feel good about making these positive impacts on people. And sometimes I tell people that a client's first goal is usually my second because they might say I want a six pack, and it's like, okay, well, we can starve you and we can, like run
yeah,
you with a rat or something. Then you're gonna hate your life. My first goal for you is to have a better life by improving the quality of life and all that stuff. And so sometimes I had a client who lost 80 pounds, got a six pack. I've told this story before, but he was like saying, like, showing me the six pack and the bicep pains, and I was like, oh, cool. But then he was telling me the other day that like he was able to go and like throw the football with his kid for an hour and had no like pain or issues. So, like that to me is the thing that makes it the most worth it. So, yeah, I definitely I like what you're saying about that because sometimes coaches do get underappreciated, but then also there's a thing where you hear the I in my mind, I'm stereotyping, but it's almost like the college strength coach who's only powerlifting and doesn't sprint or know how to touch his toes and gets winded going up the stairs talking about the macho thing that you're talking about. What is a positive change that you're noticing in the training space or coaching space?
I like that there's a reduction in gatekeeping with a lot of the higher profile or people that are under the microscope, I should say, with the likes of people like Joe Padula, Vernon Griffith, the stuff that the Coach 'em Up guys have done, Tim and Zach, Blaine
Mhm.
McConnell, Alec Blennis, like they're really throwing it all out there and they're not gatekeeping. They're recognizing that this works. And that comes from a self realization that everything is heavily nuanced. It depends, right? That's our favorite slogan. It depends. And it really does. So what's the harm in me educating people on my process based on my cohort? What is it? There is no harm, right? Anyone can take my workouts, go for it. And I mean, if you want to apply it to your cohort and you don't have the understanding how to audit it or disassemble it and make it work for you, then that's your problem. It's definitely not a problem with my
Mhm.
program. I really like seeing that. I like seeing the sharing. Of course, there always is some venture there where people are then going to pay to have access to that. And it makes sense because it's a business. But all in all, I love to see that when the algorithm gets it right, there's a lot of positivity.
I do wanna speak to that. One thing is that the gatekeeping used to be, like, the fear of people, like, stealing your recipe, but, like, I heard a quote once or something like, "You might have my recipe, but the sauce won't taste the same." Because
Yeah.
there's still a skill in, like, delivering the product at the end of the day. You still have to know how to coach. They might have the exact another coach who has a lot less experience and skill may have the exact same program that you wrote and not know how to get the same results out of it because they don't have the soft skills that you're talking about, or they don't understand the nuances of training. They can't explain why they're doing something as well. They can't coach the actual drill very well. So there's a lot of that. The other thing too is in doing so, I think you're just increasing your value by showing people what you have to offer. So it is almost like a marketing opportunity in that sense. I don't like sleazy marketing, but if you're actually doing it out of the kindness of your heart, then I find it to be beneficial.
Sure.
And then I also one of the reasons why I started this podcast is, yes, because, like, you say that you're very isolated, it was the same thing for me. My county's 5,000 people. My buddies don't like training, but, like, this is a way for I make the joke that it's like, I tell my wife after this, like, podcast and all the other episodes, I feel like a five-year-old coming home from preschool, like, "Oh, I made a friend, we both like dinosaurs," but it's just a nice way for me to connect with people. This is networking, but it's not a sleazy way to network.
Mhm.
But the other thing too is by putting my voice out there, I'm allowing myself to be scrutinized, which means that I have to be better about my thoughts in that sense. I have to justify them or learn if, I'm scrutinized and someone actually has a good point. But then also if the field as a whole gets better and, we're all competitive as coaches, that means I have to get better. And then as the field gets better, I learn off other people, other smart coaches. So I only see it as like a net positive at the end of the day, doing what you're talking about. And I appreciate you talk about it because I also feel that that's an area that isn't discussed enough. One of the topics I think we talked about, and if I'm taking too much of your time, you let me know because this might be a bigger one, is the older kind of generation of coaches saying
Mm.
to like younger coaches like us that maybe we just don't know enough yet. And I saw I don't want to name names because anyway, but there's one coach who once said that you have to do another a genius coaches like program for like 2-3 years before you're allowed to write your first program. And I was just like, I don't know about that. Like, it's like you have to learn how to coach before you learn how to write a program. And it's like learning how to write a program is one of the best ways to learn how to coach. You actually get to test your theories, like immediately. I don't know. I just feel like that delays the process, whatever. But there are definitely coaches that will look down on trainers if they're super fit. They'll say, "Oh, you're just a fit guy," or if you're young, they'll say you don't have experience or whatever. But I think quality of experience matters just as much as volume of experience. And also, I don't think anyone can criticize your volume of experience. I think you said you have 7 teams and you work like 10 hours a day. I
Mhm.
think in 10 years, you've accumulated more experience than some coaches will do in 20 or 30. So age isn't really a factor in that as well. Can you speak to the, kinda older coaches looking down on younger coaches thing as well?
Plenty to say here, and I'll try and make it pretty concise. First and foremost, there's obviously truth in all that because you have to go through the ringer to
Mhm,
figure it out. But like you just said, like 10 years of coaching, that's pretty much all I've been doing. Multiple teams, thousands of athletes. Did I get it right all the time? No, but I know I've gotten it right a majority of time from a human standpoint and a physiological standpoint. Does that mean I know everything? No. I feel like I've woken up in the last 2 years and recognized that there's so much more to learn, and once you get over that hump, then you can truly learn. You actually kinda regress from your confidence, if you will, and start recognizing that there's so many ways to skin the cat that, you just become a little bit more reserved.
mhm,
Now Granted, with that much exposure to things and that many problems to solve, like going through COVID, working within a small space, working with developing athletes, working with adults, working with pros, working with U6 athletes, like you get to a certain point that I can confidently say that at 28 or yep, 28, I'm going on 29, that I have accumulated enough knowledge to say that I know what I'm talking about. Will I say that I'm anywhere near the greatness of Stu McMillan? No, not at all. But I don't think someone of his pedigree should also speak down on a younger cohort. Why? Because we have the most up to date. If we have the capacity to discern between what's right and wrong, we can discern what is being said within the research while in conjunction talking with people that have anecdotal experience, looking at our own experience, being introspective, questioning things, and being curious. If we are someone with that capacity, then I don't see why why we can't be held in higher regard. We have access to all that they've learned. We're putting ourselves in situations to learn from our experiences. So I think it's ridiculous to say otherwise, that younger coaches can speak up, can have a voice, can have mentorships. You know, in 10 years from now, I'll probably look at the stuff I talked about and be laughing at it, but that's part of growing, right? And if we adopt this mentality that we're going to shut down certain people for having voices, then that's just putting us in a worse position in the field. Now, one caveat to all of this, we all have personal biases and we all adopt or bring these biases into all of our thought processes.
Mm.
So immediately I go into defending because I feel like I'm a young coach who has things that are of value to say. Because I also recognize that I don't know everything, that doesn't just afford me the ability to say what I want. But a lot of these things that are being said by other coaches is more or less directed towards young coaches who just simply talk out of their ass, right? Like, it's not saying that if you are below the age of 35 or you haven't coached for 20 years that you can't say anything. I hold Joe Padula in high regard. Think he's kind of like the guy that I want to be, and he's 3 years younger than I am. Right? That's knowledge and competency, and it's clear. But then there's also people who are 40 years old, and I will say it, Tony Greco, people like that. The kids, if they heard that, they would laugh because they know I have a gripe with that guy. But 50 years old and is just talking shit and saying all these things, and people are drinking the Kool-Aid. So what is it? Is it years of experience? Is it flashy stuff? I think it just has to be narrowed down to the simple fact that if you're trying to sell snake oil, you're a snake, and you're just polluting the minds, go back, learn some things and experiment. But if you are young, you've put yourself in a position to question, comment, and be curious, then there's zero reason why you shouldn't have a voice.
The, yeah, what did you just say? You said, "If you're selling snake oil, then you're a snake." I'm gonna use that.
Yeah.
The other one I heard recently was, "It's a pity that the most punchable faces are often the least punched."
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I thought that was a kind of a funny one, but no, I really appreciate your opinion on that. So, what feels like a touchdown in your job? What, like, brings you the most satisfaction or joy?
Yeah, I think when you see character changes, whether it's on the daily or it's on season length, you'll see these kids that come in and they're allergic to the gym. They don't want to be in there, and they're hiding in their corner. They're cutting corners and stuff. But you slowly break down those walls, and you find some way to connect with them, and then they end up becoming your hardest worker, or at least they start giving a crap. That's always fulfilling for me. I'm fortunate where I get a good number of messages, whether it's daily or throughout the years, of present or past clients and athletes that, like I mentioned earlier, say, "Hey, Josh, thank you." Like those mental toughness Wednesdays, those hard sessions, those crazy things. I'll never forget that, and I thank you for that. That's of a great benefit to me. Like it just makes me feel good that okay, people are learning the lessons because I'm very intentional with doing things, and I want them to find out what those lessons are. I'm not going to be upfront of like sometimes I will be, but most of the time I'm putting you through hell right now because it's going to benefit you as a young man, as an athlete, as a person in society. So for them to have this self-recognition that, oh, okay, this is what the lesson was, I understand it now, and drop the ego enough to reach out to me and say thank you, that just gives me a lot of energy. We have the power to change people's lives in one capacity or another, and most of the time it's in a habit or cultural or psychological capacity more so than physical.
Mhm.
It's the thing that lasts the longest, and for people to recognize that, it means a lot. So, yeah.
I guess along those lines, you work with a lot of young men, and there's this little macho alpha thing that goes around, and sometimes it is good to be humbled. You're talking about how there's this like unearned entitlement, and sometimes posturing, whatever it may be. And so I was going to an MMA gym for a little bit. I had a baby 2 months ago, so I don't have the time or money for that anymore. I went to MMA and jujitsu. I just go to the jujitsu gym now, but that's neither here nor there. When I was at the MMA gym, there's a lot of kids that are like around 18, and good sparring is like you can do, like, touch sparring, which is, like, maybe around 50%. I think good sparring could be somewhere between, like, 60 and 80%, but once you cross that, like, 80% threshold, you're not actually experimental anymore. You're just trying to survive, and it just, like, flips a switch in your head. And so there's a time and place for it, but usually you don't wanna do it every single session because CTE exists, injuries exist, you wanna, like, live to, train another day, that whole thing. And so some of these kids just need, like, to be checked, and I'm not, like, the greatest, martial artist or combat sports athlete of all time by any means. But I'm also now I turned 29 recently. I'm also a grown man going against 18-year-olds who are also not very experienced. And so there's this one kid who I was trying to take my head off, and I just kept giving him, these like gentle little kind of punches and all that stuff. And I was just like trying to show him, let's take the pace down a bit. And I feel bad to I didn't consider why he was in this headspace until afterwards. But I mean, I've like humbled some of these kids sometimes, and they've had difficult moments. And then after the session, we were able to have these honest conversations. But one kid tried taking my head off, leg kicks until he couldn't walk. I thought I can hit his body. He wants to throw up. I can hit his face. I can mess him up. Might as well go for the leg kicks. It's the most uh, merciful. Another kid got him in a triangle choke, and then, like, he wouldn't tap no matter what, and I could see the veins in his eyes, I could see him, like, almost falling asleep. I let go, and he's like all that stuff, but it's almost like you have to humble these kids that are a little crazy, and then they'll open up for whatever reason. Sometimes just giving them some humility, some toughness or something like that, they'll open up and they'll share their insecurities or their hopes or whatever, and it's just weird how what you would consider to be the most toxic space can become the least toxic space, or when you just have humility. You have all these kids that run their mouth, like I was saying, they get punched in the face once, maybe they don't run their mouth anymore, and I find that even, like, driving down the road, my road rage has gone down significantly because I'm scared of everybody now, because I don't know who knows what and all that stuff. So I think there is value in what you're talking about, giving people difficulty in life, whether it's for character building and humility. Having said that, there is a responsible way to do things. I feel like every year there's a story where there's some high school football coach in Texas who did 3-a-days and had kids die from like heat exhaustion and dehydration or something like that. So of course there's a balance, but I do appreciate you talking about that.
Oh, for sure. And leading by example for me has been the easiest way to break down those walls. Because if you're the living standard and you're something maybe above the standard or something a little bit out of, like, we're a role model to them, and I know that whatever they want to say at face value, I know a lot of them look up to me because of the way I train, the way I do things, and the standard that I hold. And I'm trying to say that in the most humble way
Sure.
possible, but it's intentional for me to get up every day and train hard because I want them to be able to look at me and be like, okay, well, he's asking me to do this, but he's ran 20 kilometers and had a big lift today, all before I woke up. Like, I think I'm gonna listen to this guy. If he's the one putting in work, I'm gonna put in work as
Mhm.
well, and that's integral. And man, we could go down a a bit of a rabbit hole talking about trainers being an example, but I think ultimately, if you're and it goes with women as well. I am fortunate to work with a women's basketball team, but that's a different nuance there. A way you connect with female athletes is different, but for men, they need strong role models. And at least from what I've recognized to be true is you need to lead by example and be there for them, and then they find comfort in knowing that you've gone through struggle and that they can open up to you in that regard.
There's definitely something to be said for that because when I had my first internship, all the high school kids that were like D1 bound didn't want to listen to me. And then they were all trying to do like pull ups or muscle ups. That's my one really good exercise. I say really good, and then I see Steve White smashing my records, and I'm like, "Oh, whatever." So, like, I would just do a muscle up and make it look effortless, and I'm like, "Whoa, like, you're stronger than you look," which is the most painful backhanded compliment one can receive.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, like, you just do something like that, and all of a sudden they wanna, "Oh, how'd you do that?" They ask you questions and all that stuff. So there's absolutely value to showing people that you walk the walk and that, like, you actually know what you're talking about. Even with the kid today where he was, like, chirping a little bit and was playful, and then I scored the 5 goals on him and I was nutmegging him and all that stuff. Something he might wanna listen to me a little bit more about kicking the ball and running and all these different things and how it may apply. The final question I have is, if you have a final piece of advice that could be to anybody about absolutely anything, what would that piece of advice be?
I'll give 3. One quick one, be a good person, always be a good person. Be the type of person to others the way you would wanna treat your mother, your father, your
Mhm.
family. That's always important. People gravitate to genuinely good people. Number 2, for coaches, understand the phrase that you gotta meet the needs with the means, that meet the needs of the athlete with the means necessary to, reach the demands. If you start playing around with that phrase and understanding that there's more than one way to crack an egg, you will slowly but surely develop a large arsenal of problem solving tools that simply is just going to make you unstoppable within your context. And then the third one is athletes, give your performance staff a break. You know, they're humans too. And they work long hours. And you know what? I know you don't like working out all the time, but we live for this stuff. We're there to make you to perform better. We put so much careful thought into all the things that we provide you, and brings us great joy to see people work hard and be successful. So go easy on us.
I really appreciate that. If you wanna be found, please plug yourself. Where can people find you and reach out to you?
Yeah, easiest thing is Bray the coach on Instagram. I got links in there if you want to go to the website, etc. But that's the easiest way to reach out. I do some mentorship for coaches. I do some online one-on-one training. Yeah, that's it.
I really appreciate your time. This was a blast. Usually the podcasts are supposed to go an hour. We're at an hour, 40 minutes now. So, yeah, I mean, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for listening to my rambling. Not the most verbally eloquent person out there, but thanks for having me on. I
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Cool.